Doctors on Reddit. What happened when you diagnosed a COVID-19 denier with COVID-19? ICU nurse here, 6 years. Dealt with COVID since March 2020, actually had the first confirmed PT at our hospital. February was rough. I had a 2-week streak where every day 1 or 2 of my patients would die. We'd go up to 3 or 4 patient assignments. The norm is 2:1 or 1:1 if on certain equipment. Most all of the patients understood the severity of what they had. A handful didn't believe they had COVID, even though removing high-flow O2 or their BiPAP would put their SATs down into the 60s or 70s. Many had comorbidities that put them at risk: cough/asthma, obesity/sleep apnea, smoking. I think people would refuse to be intubated because they knew what the outcome would be. Fight, hope, pray, fingers crossed, whatever you want to call it, delaying the inevitable. Our ICU attending would actually have them sign consent for intubation if they were cognizant enough to do so. Almost all of them died. Very few made it out alive, but still so sick and debilitated, some with trachs. One guy in particular sticks out. This was right after Christmas. 21 years old, HXDM1, obesity, sleep apnea, didn't like to take his insulin. Admitted with COVID. Didn't believe he had it. Should have been tubed days before, but refused. Then he ended up being intubated emergently. Took about 5 of us to prone him, lay him on his stomach, because his O2 SATs were in the 60s, couldn't get a pulse, noticed no waveform on the art line. Had to flip him back over to do CPR for about an hour or so before we called it. Had a kid and a fiancé. Honestly, it was more of the families that denied their loved one had COVID. Upset, understandably, about not being able to visit. Zoom calls just don't cut it. I say this all as my parents, mom/SD, and dad/SM, are all COVID deniers, even when I tell them what it's like. Well, those people had other things wrong with them though. They were older, they tell me. They send me links about all the conspiracy theories re-COVID. I got the Moderna in December and January, still haven't told them. It's awful. The facial swelling alone from being prone is enough to give a person nightmares. Watching someone go into multi-system organ failure, needing dialysis, unable to put them back onto their back, being maxed out on ventilator settings, and that still not being enough to the point of barotrauma, and collapsing a lung, and needing a chest tube to reinflate it. Families saying do everything even though they had coded once or twice. Hearing families on Zoom crying, praying, singing as the patient is intubated, sedated, and paralyzed so the ventilator can do the work. Tearing up under all the PPE, because yeah, we are still human. We work so hard, and sometimes it doesn't fucking matter. But we go back, day after day. I wish people who don't believe could see what I have seen. It might scare them enough to take precautions seriously and get the vaccine. ICU/COVID ICU charge nurse here. Had a woman try leaving the ER against medical advice with COVID and was needing tons of O2. Our docs convinced her to get admitted. My wife was her ER nurse and brought her up to me. Patient was yelling and screaming, ripping off her mask, spitting and telling us we're all sheep between gasping for breath. Our docs told her she was close to needing to be intubated, breathing tube, and she just scoffed. We reached out to the husband, who proceeded to swear and berate us, telling us we're keeping her prisoner, no visitors in our COVID unit, and that we can do whatever we need, because none of this is real, and it's all for show so you guys can get paid. She gets intubated, decompensates over the next few days, and finally codes. We code, perform CPR, give medications, defibrillate, etc. Her for well over 1.5 HR before calling her time of death. The kicker was calling her husband and getting absolutely excoriated because we injected her with COVID as an experiment and killed her. He then had to be escorted out of the hospital when he came in to try getting up to the unit without a mask, of course. This shit's getting exhausting. ER doctor here. I diagnose people with COVID on the daily. Some people are actually really great about it, others are more difficult. I'll tell you a tale that occurred during my most recent shift. Back-to-back rooms and patients. Patient A, in room #4, is a 23-year-old male, no medical history, comes in with body aches, malaise, and fatigue. Also had some mild nausea without abdominal pain or vomiting. Patient B, in room #5, is a 51-year-old female, medical history of intermittent asthma, so she uses a puffer infrequently, comes in with shortness of breath, has some possible fevers at home. In triage it was noted that this patient's oxygen sats were in the 88 range, and her heart rate wasn't elevated. Interestingly, when asked if she thought she had COVID, she said, "I can't have it. I tested negative 2 weeks ago when my son tested positive. He's been sick at home." You guessed it. Both people COVID plus. Patient went home. He's doing great. Was extremely remorseful, and before he'd even left the ED he called his work to let them know he was positive, and to get everyone there tested, because he figured he had gotten the illness at work. He worked in a small family-owned warehouse as a foreman. He also called his parents, and they were getting him set up to sleep in the garage until his quarantine was up. I respected this guy. Patient B got admitted to the hospital because her O2 sats weren't great. When I went back to tell her she was COVID plus, she called me a liar and told me I must have made a mistake. She threatened to sign out AMA against medical advice, but when she got up to leave she got so short of breath the nurse used that to convince her to stay. People are strange sometimes. I try not to let stuff bother me, but COVID deniers come very close to crossing that line. One story stands out. Last summer a guy came to the ED with symptoms and tested positive. He refused admission for the classic list of reasons. It's a complete hoax, and even if it's not a complete hoax it's not that big a deal, I'm strong enough, etc. Couple days later he was back in the ED with his mom, who he lived with, and who was now also symptomatic. They were both admitted, and eventually put on ventilators. Guy lived, but his mom didn't. Nurse here. I had COVID, and now I'm in rehabilitation, because my lungs are at 70% capacity, now. I was at 40% capacity, and now when I hear someone say that, I have the urge to slap them with a chair. I will need another year until I'm fully recovered. Edit. I thank you all the kind words and the awards. You guys/gals are awesome. Not a doctor, but my cousin-in-law was a COVID denier. Went to his COVID denier girlfriend's family house for Thanksgiving without telling his parents that they were COVID deniers. He was living with his parents, my wife's aunt and uncle, since he had recently divorced his wife. Got back and found out a week later that the whole girlfriend's family tested positive. He got it. So his parents both got it. His mother was in treatment for breast cancer, and his dad had asthma BTW, and they are not COVID deniers. His mother recovered, but his dad, my wife's uncle, went from coughing and wheezing the day after Christmas to the ER on New Year's Day. Within 24 hours after that he was put on a ventilator. 3 weeks later he passed. So yeah, my COVID denier cousin-in-law effectively killed my wife's uncle, and now that whole part of the family is really tense as his brothers kinda blame him for killing their dad, but their mom, wife's aunt, isn't willing to blame her son. Fuck COVID deniers. It's not really a joke. These assholes are literally killing people through gross negligence and idiocy. As an anesthesiologist, By the time someone's calling for us, it's for intubation, and the patient is in no condition to deny anything. Honestly, it's usually the family that's the issue, and that needs to be escorted from the room.